Harlem in the early 1930s did not sleep, it endured. The nights were thick with trumpet notes and cigarette smoke, with laughter that sometimes sounded too loud and arguments that sometimes ended too quickly. Street lamps cast long shadows across Lenox Avenue, stretching like silent witnesses over brownstone stoops and rain-soaked pavement. The Great Depression had tightened its grip on America, and though headlines spoke of markets and banks, the real story lived in the faces of working mothers, aging veterans, and young boys learning too early what hunger felt like. In that uneasy rhythm of jazz and hardship, one name traveled in whispers, never shouted, never flaunted, but carried carefully from one doorway to the next. Bumpy Johnson. He did not arrive like a storm. He did not demand attention. When Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, walked down the street, he did so with measured steps, his dark overcoat tailored but unflashy, his hat brimmed low enough to shield his eyes but not his presence. His reputation had grown over years, not because he was the loudest man in the room, but because he was often the calmest. In neighborhoods where power was frequently displayed through force, Bumpy's strength was revealed through restraint. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered what others forgot. And when he gave his word, it held. That winter, tension had begun simmering in Harlem like a pot left too long on the stove. Dutch Schultz's shadow still lingered over parts of the city, his influence stretching like an invisible fence that cut through black neighborhoods without asking permission. Though alliances had shifted and negotiations had drawn uneasy boundaries, there was always the threat of humiliation, of someone trying to remind Harlem who supposedly controlled its future. Bumpy understood these dynamics better than most. He knew that territory was not just measured in streets, but in dignity. On a bitterly cold evening, as snow threatened to fall but held back in a gray sky of hesitation, Bumpy sat in a small back room of a neighborhood restaurant. The establishment was modest polished wooden tables, faded photographs of jazz musicians on the walls, a jukebox that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. The owner, Mr. Halpern, had kept the place open through grit and grace, serving plates of stew to men who often paid late but never lied about it. Bumpy respected that kind of integrity. Across the table sat two of his trusted associates, men who had learned over time that Bumpy's silence was not absence, but calculation. A conversation was unfolding about increasing pressure from certain outside businessmen who believed Harlem's struggling economy made it vulnerable. There were whispers of new security arrangements, thinly veiled attempts to extract money from local shopkeepers under the promise of protection. The language was polished, but the intent was not. "They're pushing too hard," one associate muttered, frustration leaking into his tone. "They think people are desperate enough to accept anything." Bumpy leaned back slightly, fingers interlocked, his expression unreadable. "Desperation," he said evenly, "is what makes men careless. We will not be careless." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it settled over the room like a final decision. He understood that if Harlem was to survive economically and spiritually, it needed stability, not panic. He did not romanticize his position. He knew the contradictions of his world. But he believed firmly that within chaos, a man could still choose his principles. As the meeting concluded, Bumpy stepped outside into the cold air. Snow had finally begun falling, thin flakes drifting down like quiet confessions. The streetlights reflected against the growing frost, and Harlem's pulse softened under the weight of winter. He adjusted his gloves and began walking, preferring the clarity that came from moving through his own streets rather than riding behind tinted glass. Halfway down the block, he noticed a small gathering near a pharmacy owned by a widowed woman named Mrs. Carter. She had taken over the store after her husband passed unexpectedly, and though business had been difficult, she refused to close. She believed in service, in familiarity, in knowing her customers by name. Bumpy admired her resolve. Tonight, however, her resolve was being tested. Two well-dressed men stood near the entrance, their coats expensive, their expressions rehearsed into polite indifference. One of them held a clipboard. The other scanned the storefront with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Carter stood in the doorway, her shoulders squared despite the tremor in her hands. "You have until the end of the week," the man with the clipboard was saying smoothly. "After that, our organization can't guarantee the same favorable terms." Bumpy slowed his pace but did not immediately intervene. He listened. He watched. Mrs. Carter's voice, though steady, carried strain. "I've paid my suppliers. I've paid my rent. I owe no one anything." The second man chuckled softly. "Everyone owes someone, Mrs. Carter. It's simply a matter of realizing it." The implication hung in the air, heavy and corrosive. Bumpy stepped forward then, his footsteps deliberate against the snow-dusted pavement. The men noticed him and exchanged a quick glance. They knew who he was. Most did. "Evening," Bumpy said calmly, tipping his hat slightly in acknowledgement rather. Then submission. The clipboard man straightened. "This is private business." Bumpy's gaze shifted from one man to the other before settling on Mrs. Carter, whose relief was subtle but undeniable. "In Harlem," he replied quietly, "the well-being of our neighbors is never private." There was no threat in his tone, no raised voice. Just clarity. The second man folded his arms. "We're offering assistance, protection, stability during uncertain times." "Stability," Bumpy repeated thoughtfully. "That's a valuable thing." He stepped closer, close enough that the falling snow settled across the shoulders of all three men equally. "But stability built on fear," he added, his voice softening further, "has a habit of collapsing." Silence stretched between them, longer than comfort allowed. The two outsiders were accustomed to intimidation working quickly. They were less accustomed to calm resistance that did not escalate. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," the clipboard man warned. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I'm making it simple." He reached into his coat pocket, not for a weapon, not for money, but for a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the man. "A list," he explained. "Names of shopkeepers who contribute to neighborhood upkeep, snow removal, food drives, school supplies. Mrs. Carter's name is on it." The man skimmed the paper, confusion flickering across his face. "Anyone who threatens them," Bumpy continued, "threatens every name on that list. And every name on that list," he paused briefly, allowing the weight of his words to settle, "answers to me." There was no bravado, no dramatic gesture. Just a fact stated plainly. The snow fell thicker now, muffling the city's distant noise. The two men weighed their options. They had come expecting submission born of hardship. Instead, they found unity anchored in quiet authority. "We'll revisit this," the second man muttered, stepping back. Bumpy inclined his head slightly. "I'll be here." They left without further argument, their polished shoes disappearing into the white blur of the street. Mrs. Carter exhaled shakily, gripping the doorframe as though her legs had temporarily forgotten their purpose. "You didn't have to," she began. "I did," Bumpy interrupted gently. "Because if one store falls, others will follow. And fear spreads faster than snow." Her eyes glistened, not with helplessness, but with gratitude too deep for immediate words. Bumpy adjusted his hat once more and offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Keep your lights on," he said. "Harlem needs them." As he walked away, he did not look back to measure the impact of his intervention. He did not need applause. He understood something fundamental. Dignity preserved in small moments prevents devastation in larger ones. But beneath that quiet victory, a larger storm was forming. Word of resistance travels quickly, especially when it interrupts someone else's expectations. By choosing to stand beside Mrs. Carter, Bumpy had drawn a subtle line in the snow. And lines once drawn invite challenges. That night, as he sat alone in his modest study, shelves lined with worn books of philosophy and poetry. Bumpy reflected not on the confrontation itself, but on its implications. He knew the men would report back, he knew alliances might shift, and he knew that protecting Harlem's dignity would require more than symbolic gestures in the days ahead. He opened a small, leather-bound notebook and wrote a single sentence: "Power must never forget who it serves." Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the streets in deceptive quiet. But beneath that stillness, tension moved like an unseen current, preparing to test not just Bumpy's influence, but his principles, and Harlem, though unaware of the full storm approaching, slept a little easier that night because someone had chosen to stand without shouting, to lead without boasting, and to protect without demanding recognition. The true challenge, however, was only beginning. Harlem woke the next morning under a thin blanket of snow that looked clean until you watched a shoe press into it and reveal the grit underneath. That was the way life felt in those years, white on the surface, bruised beneath. The pharmacy. Lights Mrs. Carter kept on all night still glowed faintly when Bumpy Johnson passed by again, and he noted it without pride, the way a man notes a street lamp that hasn't gone out. Harlem's dignity was not for sale. The trouble with lines, though, was that they didn't just protect what was inside them. They also dared outsiders to test where, exactly, the boundary ended. By late afternoon, the city had started talking in pieces. A remark here, a warning there. The two polished men who had tried to corner Mrs. Carter had gone back downtown with cold anger in their bones, the kind that doesn't shout right away but plans. Someone wanted Harlem to feel small again, wanted shopkeepers to believe they were alone, wanted mothers to lower their eyes when uniforms walked by. Bumpy sensed it the way he sensed weather through shifts in tone, the absence of laughter where it usually lived, the way men stood near corners with hands in their pockets, for warmth and for readiness. Still, he refused to rush. Panic was the oldest trap in the world. If Harlem panicked, Harlem would fracture. And once a neighborhood fractured, it could be bought. That evening, Bumpy attended a charity card game held in the back room of a jazz club on 133rd. The music out front was bright, almost defiant, but behind the curtain, the air was heavier, thick with cigar smoke and the unspoken knowledge that every man at the table carried responsibility bigger than himself. Bumpy wasn't there for money. He was there for information. Information was the only thing that moved faster than fear, and if he controlled information, he could control the shape of the coming storm. A saxophone wailed in the next room, and in the middle of that long note, a man slipped into the back corridor and waited with the nervous stillness of someone who had been told to stand there until summoned. Bumpy saw him without looking directly. His peripheral vision was as sharp as any blade, sharpened by years of listening without appearing to. He let the game continue for two more hands, then rose calmly, pushing his chair back with no dramatic scrape. He stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him. The man was a messenger from a bartender who had ears in places. Bartenders often do, places where men with loose tongues talk too freely after their third drink. The messenger's voice was low. "They're planning something, Mr. Johnson." "Not tonight. Soon." Bumpy didn't ask who. In Harlem, they had many faces, but the intent was always the same: make someone feel powerless, then sell them hope at a price. "What kind of something?" Bumpy asked quietly. The messenger swallowed. "They want an example, something public, something that makes folks careful again." Bumpy's eyes narrowed slightly, the smallest shift in an otherwise calm face. An example of who? The messenger hesitated, then answered like a man pushing a stone off a cliff. "A child, or a mother. Somebody nobody can protect without looking like they're starting a war." Bumpy stood still for a long moment, absorbing not just the words, but the design behind them. That was how cruelty worked when it wanted to be efficient. It didn't strike the strongest first. It struck what was most innocent, because innocence draws the crowd and fear draws silence. A public humiliation would not only hurt the victim, it would train everyone watching to accept it. He nodded once, not in agreement, but to signal understanding. "Go back," he told the messenger. "Tell your bartender to keep his ears open and his opinions shut." The man nodded and disappeared. Bumpy returned to the card table, but the game no longer interested him. Not because he was afraid fear was useful only when it sharpened judgment, but because he had recognized the pattern. They were going to use the oldest trick in American cities: accuse the powerless, press the badge against their throat, and dare the neighborhood to interfere. And if anyone interfered, they'd call it disorder. They'd call it criminal. They'd call it proof that Harlem couldn't govern itself. Bumpy knew Dutch Schultz's style well enough, not as a rumor, but as a reality that had touched every borough. Schultz's power wasn't only in violence. It was in the way he could bend men who believed they were untouchable politicians, police captains, businessmen, into forming a wall that the poor could never climb. Even after Schultz's most famous days had passed into legend and caution, his methods had outlived him in the habits of men who learned from his era. And those men still walked New York with their hands clean and their intentions dirty. Later that night, Bumpy took a long route home, choosing streets that let him see Harlem's mood without being seen himself. The sidewalks had thinned. The usual corner laughter was quieter. Mothers pulled children closer. Shop owners locked up earlier. It wasn't just winter cold that made people hurry. It was the sense that something unseen was moving toward them. Halfway down 131st, he heard it. Not at first as a scream, but as a sound that made the air tighten. A woman's voice cracking. In two. Then the scream arrived fully, tearing across the street like a siren, raw and unfiltered and honest in a way that no man could mistake for theatrics. It did not belong to nightlife. It belonged to life and death. The block froze. Windows lifted. Doors creaked open a fraction. Men paused mid-step, eyes darting, calculations already forming. Because in Harlem, people had learned a cruel lesson. Sometimes even witnessing could cost you. Bumpy didn't run. He didn't shout for his men. He simply turned toward the sound, as though the street itself had called his name. His pace was controlled, steady, because urgency without control was the fastest way to make a bad situation worse. As he reached the corner, the scene sharpened beneath the dim street lamps. Flicker. A boy 12, maybe 13, thin in the way children got when meals were stretched, stood pinned against brick. His cheeks were wet, not with tears, but with melted snow. Two police officers towered over him. One held the boy's collar, pulling him forward like a man displaying a prize. The other kept his baton loose at his side, tapping it against his palm in a rhythm that wasn't casual at all. It was performance. A warning. On the ground, a woman knelt. She wasn't begging in the polite way that made authority comfortable. She was begging with a mother's full body, hands trembling, face contorted, voice hoarse from pleading. "He didn't do anything. He's just coming home. Please." The officers ignored her like she was part of the sidewalk. Their focus was the boy and the crowd they wanted to gather. Their eyes flicked to the windows, to the neighbors, to the men lingering at the edges. This wasn't about justice. This was about instruction. The taller officer spoke loudly, for the benefit of everyone listening. "Theft. Store owner says he took a gold watch. That's a serious charge." The boy shook his head so fast it looked like it might snap. "I didn't, sir." "I swear." "Don't sir me," the officer snapped, jerking the boy's collar. "Harder." The baton tapped again, louder now. Bumpy stopped several feet away, not inserting himself immediately, not escalating the air with sudden confrontation. His presence was enough to change the temperature. People recognized him the way sailors recognize a lighthouse. Relief, fear, and curiosity all surfaced at once. The baton officer's gaze finally landed on Bumpy. His tapping slowed, then stopped. "This doesn't concern you, Johnson," he muttered, trying to sound dismissive. But a hint of uncertainty slipped through. Bumpy's eyes moved from the officers to the boy, then to the mother. He saw the boy's hands empty. He saw the mother's nails broken from gripping at fabric and brick. He saw something else, too. The way the officers were positioned, the angle of the crowd, the placement beneath the street lamp. This had been staged, an accusation designed for visibility. A pressure point meant to force Harlem into submission through shame. Bumpy stepped forward one pace. "Then why," he asked calmly, "does it concern a child?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It carried because it didn't tremble. It carried because it didn't beg. It carried because it was measured, as though he were asking about the weather. The officer holding the boy's collar tightened his jaw. "We have a report. We have a witness." Bumpy nodded as if he respected procedures. "Witnesses are useful," he said. "Evidence is better." The baton officer snorted. "We don't need your opinion." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "I'm not offering an opinion," he replied softly. "I'm asking a question." A pause, the kind of pause that tells you everyone is listening now, including men who pretend they aren't. Bumpy looked at the boy again. "Have you searched him?" The collar officer hesitated, then patted the boy down quickly, more for show than sincerity. "No watch, no chain, no bulge in a pocket, nothing." The crowd's breath changed. Quiet murmurs rose like smoke. Bumpy nodded once. "Then you don't have theft," he said. "You have an accusation." The collar officer's face reddened. "You trying to tell me how to do my job?" Bumpy stepped closer, not aggressively, not into their personal space, but into the space where truth needed to stand. "I'm telling you," he said, "that Harlem is watching." The baton officer's hand twitched as if to restart the tapping, to regain his performance. But he didn't, because now the performance was no longer theirs alone. Bumpy had entered the stage, and unlike them, he didn't need props. "Move along," the baton officer barked toward the windows. "This is police business." Bumpy didn't respond to the bark. He responded to the reason behind it. "Police business," he repeated thoughtfully. "Then let's conduct it properly." He reached into his coat pocket slowly. The crowd stiffened. Men always stiffened when a hand went into a coat in those days. But Bumpy's movement was deliberate in a way that calmed rather than alarmed. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, not money, not a weapon. He held it up between his fingers. "I know the store owners around here," he said. "I know who's honest, and I know who's hungry enough to tell a lie for a man who pays him." He looked directly at the collar officer. "Which store claims this boy took a watch?" The collar officer faltered. The baton officer shifted. In that hesitation, the truth leaked out like heat from a cracked window. They hadn't expected to be questioned. They hadn't expected someone to speak with calm authority instead of emotional outrage. Outrage would have given them an excuse. Calm gave them a mirror. "We're taking him in," the collar officer insisted, grasping for control. "Let the courts handle it." Bumpy's tone remained even, almost gentle. "Courts," he said, "handle a lot of things. But tonight, I'm looking at a child who will spend the night in a cell because somebody wanted a lesson taught. And I'm looking at a mother who will spend the night believing she failed him." The mother's sobbing softened into a trembling silence, as if she couldn't afford to hope too quickly. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, as though weighing the next words carefully. "If the store has a witness," he said, "bring the witness. Here. Let the witness look this boy in the face, in front of his mother, in front of the neighbors, and tell the truth out loud." The officers' eyes flicked to each other. They did not want a witness. A witness could become accountable. A staged accusation could not survive under light. The baton officer scoffed. "We don't take orders from you." Bumpy nodded once. "I understand," he replied, "so I won't give you an order." He stepped back half a pace and looked at the crowd. Men leaned in slightly. Women watched from behind curtains. Bumpy's voice stayed calm, but now it widened, reaching everyone. "I'm going to ask," he said, "if anyone saw this boy steal a watch." Silence, the kind of silence that had teeth. Then an elderly man near the doorway of a building spoke, voice shaky but firm. "I saw him come down this street," the man said, hands empty. "He stopped to help me with my groceries." Another voice, a woman at a window. "He was at my stoop 5 minutes ago. He was asking my little girl about school." The crowd began to find its courage, piece by piece. Not loud courage, not reckless courage. The kind of courage that grows when someone gives it permission to exist. The collar officer's grip loosened slightly, as though even he realized the tide was shifting. Bumpy turned back to the officers. "There," he said quietly. "You have witnesses." The baton officer's eyes hardened. "You trying to start a riot?" Bumpy's gaze remained steady. "No," he said. "I'm trying to prevent one." That sentence landed like a door closing, because it reframed everything. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a threat. It was a solution offered with dignity. For a long moment, no one moved. Snow fell. The street lamp flickered. The boy's breathing was loud in the silence. Then Bumpy took one more step forward, close enough that the officers could hear him without. The crowd, his voice lowered, calm as velvet. "A mother's scream travels," he said. "It travels farther than a badge. Tonight, it reached me." The collar officer swallowed. The baton officer's grip tightened, not on the baton, but on his pride. Pride was dangerous. Pride made men do foolish things. Bumpy watched their faces, reading them like pages he'd studied before. He understood their position. Back down, and they lose face. Push forward, and they create a moment Harlem will never forget that, so Bumpy gave them a third door. A way out that didn't require apology, but did require decency. "You can correct this," he said quietly. "You can say the report was incomplete. You can say you'll verify the store. You can let this boy go home. And you can walk away, without making this street your enemy." The baton officer's eyes narrowed. "Our enemy?" Bumpy's expression didn't change. "No," he said. "Your shame." That was the turning point. Not a punch, not a threat. A single word placed precisely where it belonged. The officer stood frozen, pride wrestling with practicality. "Finally." The collar officer cleared his throat. "Looks like we may have received incomplete information." A murmur swept through the crowd, not triumphant, but relieved. The baton officer looked like he wanted to protest, but his partner had already chosen the safer path. "We'll verify the report," the collar officer muttered, letting go of the boy's collar. The boy stumbled forward, knees nearly buckling. From tension. His mother caught him, arms wrapping around him so tightly, it looked like she could stitch him back into safety by sheer force. Tears streamed down her face, not of defeat now, but of release. The officer stepped away, retreating into the night with stiff shoulders and wounded pride. No apology, but also no arrest. In Harlem, sometimes survival came wrapped in imperfections. Bumpy watched them go without satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been easy. He chose something harder. Calm. He turned to the boy, whose eyes were wide with disbelief. Bumpy's voice softened. "Stand tall," he said. "You didn't do wrong, so don't carry wrong in your back." The boy nodded shakily, as if memorizing the words. The mother looked up at Bumpy, trying to speak through tears. "Mr. Johnson," she began. Bumpy lifted a hand gently, stopping her, not out of arrogance but out of modesty. "Your voice saved him," he said. "You screamed when the world wanted you quiet." She covered her mouth, shoulders trembling as she tried not to sob again. The crowd began to disperse slowly, still stunned. Children peered from windows. Men exhaled long-held breath. One of Bumpy's associates, who had arrived during the confrontation, leaned close and murmured, They wanted a public example. Bumpy nodded once. They got one, he said quietly. Just not the one they planned. As Bumpy walked away, Harlem resumed its pulse, but something had changed. The street felt different, not because injustice had vanished, but because someone had interrupted it without turning the block into a battlefield. People would talk about it tomorrow in barbershops and laundries and church basements. Not with wild exaggeration, but with something rarer, a story of dignity winning without blood. And yet, Bumpy knew better than to believe the storm had passed. Men who stage humiliation do not stop after one failure. They adjust. They escalate. They look for weaker targets, darker corners, and sharper traps. The mother's scream had frozen Harlem for a moment. Bumpy's calm had melted the trap before it could harden into tragedy. But now, somewhere downtown, a different kind of man would hear about what happened and decide that Bumpy Johnson's quiet line in the snow needed to be erased. Because in New York, the most dangerous thing a powerful system can encounter is not violence. It is a man who refuses to be afraid. And in the days that followed, the city would make Bumpy prove again what his calm was truly made of. By the time the story of the mother's scream had traveled through Harlem's barbershops and church pews, it had grown quieter, not louder. That was the peculiar thing about dignity. It didn't need exaggeration to survive. Men retold it not with fireworks, but with nods. Women repeated it with a softening in their eyes. A boy had gone home instead of to a cell. A mother had kept her child. And a street that had been prepared to witness humiliation had instead witnessed restraint. In neighborhoods accustomed to chaos, restraint could feel revolutionary, but restraint, Bumpy knew, also invited retaliation. He sat alone in Alunang, his study late one evening, the lamp casting a golden circle across his desk. Outside, Harlem hummed with cautious normalcy. He turned a page in a thin book of philosophy he often read when the world felt loud. The words were not about power, but about responsibility. He had learned long ago that if a man surrounded himself only with ambition, he would forget why he sought it. A soft knock interrupted his reading. It was Elijah, one of his most observant associates, not the strongest, not the loudest, but the kind of man who noticed the details others overlooked. Elijah stepped inside, removed his hat, and spoke carefully. "They're not going to try that again at night," he said. "They're planning something in daylight." Bumpy closed the book gently, marking the page with a ribbon rather than bending the corner. "Daylight," he repeated thoughtfully. Elijah nodded. "Public. Official. They want it to look clean." That was worse. Nighttime confrontations could be explained away. They could be denied. But daylight carried legitimacy. If humiliation happened under the sun, it would feel sanctioned. It would look like order rather than cruelty. "Who?" Bumpy asked quietly. "Not the same officers," Elijah replied. "Higher up, someone downtown doesn't like being embarrassed." Bumpy leaned back slightly, considering the architecture of pride. When a system is challenged calmly, it does not forget. It studies, it adjusts. It seeks a method that cannot be countered with the same strategy twice. "Where?" Bumpy asked. Elijah hesitated. "The school." That word settled heavily in the room. Public School 89 stood 3 blocks from Mrs. Carter's pharmacy. It was not a grand building, but it was sacred ground in Harlem. Inside those brick walls, children were allowed to imagine futures that the streets sometimes denied them. Teachers worked beyond exhaustion to keep hope alive in chalk dust and worn textbooks. If something happened there, if authority made an example in front of classrooms and parents, it would send a message sharper than any baton. Bumpy rose slowly from his chair. "When?" "Tomorrow," Elijah said. "Midday." Bumpy nodded once. "Then we'll be there." The next morning arrived with deceptive brightness. Sunlight reflected off melting snow, giving the streets a false softness. Children hurried toward school with books tucked under arms, their breath visible. In the cold, mothers lingered on sidewalks a little longer than usual, as if sensing something unspoken. Bumpy did not arrive at this school like a commander. He wore a simple coat, hat low, hands gloved against the chill. He positioned himself across the street, leaning lightly against a lamppost, appearing to be just another man observing the neighborhood's rhythm. But his eyes missed nothing. At exactly 11:45, 2 city cars rolled up to the curb. They were not patrol wagons. They were cleaner, polished, deliberate. 3 men stepped out, 2 in tailored suits, 1 in a crisp uniform bearing insignia higher than the officers from the night before. Their expressions were not angry. They were composed in the way men are composed when they believe procedure protects them. They entered the school. Minutes passed. Children's voices drifted faintly through open windows. Then the front doors opened again, and the suited men emerged with the principal beside them. The principal's face was tight, forced into professional calm. Behind them, escorted firmly but not violently, walked a familiar figure. Mrs. Carter. She looked smaller in daylight, without the pharmacy doorway framing her courage. Her coat was buttoned hastily, hair slightly undone, as if she had been summoned without explanation. 2 teachers trailed uncertainly behind, their expressions conflicted. Bumpy felt the first real flicker of anger stir beneath his calm, but he did not move. Yet, the uniformed official spoke loudly enough for gathering parents to hear. "We are investigating financial discrepancies tied to local businesses. Mrs. Carter has been named in a report involving illegal financial arrangements." Murmurs rippled instantly. Illegal arrangements. The phrase was vague but potent. It didn't need detail. It planted suspicion. It stained reputation. Mrs. Carter's voice shook, but she stood upright. "That's not true," she said. "I've done nothing wrong." The suited man beside her adjusted his cufflinks. "You've been receiving protection from criminal influences," he said smoothly. "We need you to clarify those associations." There it was. They couldn't arrest a child. They couldn't win that night confrontation. So they chose a different strategy. Tie an honest businesswoman to Bumpy publicly. Frame dignity as corruption. Make protection look like coercion. The parents watching began whispering nervously. If Mrs. Carter was implicated, what did that mean for their own businesses? For their children? Bumpy stepped off the lamppost. He crossed the street without haste, each step measured. The crowd noticed him before the officials did. The murmurs shifted tone, not louder, but steadier. The uniformed man turned just as Bumpy approached within conversational distance. "Good afternoon," Bumpy said politely. The suited official's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Johnson," he replied. "We're conducting city business." "So I see," Bumpy said calmly. Mrs. Carter looked at him, a mixture of relief and fear in her expression. This was not a street corner at night. This was daylight, witnesses everywhere, authority dressed in legality. "You're interfering with an investigation," the uniformed man warned. Bumpy shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I'm observing." The suited official smiled thinly. "This woman has admitted to receiving protection." Bumpy's gaze shifted to Mrs. Carter. "Have you?" he asked quietly. Her chin lifted slightly. "I've received support from neighbors who believe in keeping our street safe," she said. "If that's protection, then yes." A calculated pause. The official seized on it. "There, you see? An admission." Bumpy's voice remained even. "An admission of community," he corrected. The crowd's breathing synchronized subtly. The uniformed man stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, your influence has created a shadow economy here." Bumpy tilted his head slightly, as though examining the phrase. "Shadow," he repeated. "Interesting word." He took a slow step closer, not invading space, but narrowing the gap between accusation and clarity. "Tell me," he continued calmly, "did Mrs. Carter threaten anyone?" "No." "Did she refuse taxes?" No. Did she close her store to anyone based on race, religion, or background? The official hesitated. No. Then what exactly is her crime? Bumpy asked quietly. The suited man stiffened. Association. The word hung in the cold air like smoke. Bumpy allowed silence to stretch before responding. Association, he said softly. With her neighbors? With you, the official snapped. There it was. The true target revealed in daylight. Parents exchanged looks. Teachers shifted uncomfortably. The accusation wasn't about Mrs. Carter's conduct. It was about punishing her for not standing alone. Bumpy's voice lowered slightly, not in secrecy but in gravity. You came to a school, he said, during class hours to escort a widow in front of children. Because she knows my name. The official opened his mouth to respond, but Bumpy continued, his tone unwavering. You want an example, he said. You want these parents to believe that helping each other invites punishment. The suited man's composure cracked briefly. We want lawful order, Bumpy nodded. So do I. Another silence. Longer this time. Bumpy reached into his coat, not quickly, not dramatically, and removed a folded document. He handed it to the uniformed official. It was a copy of Mrs. Carter's tax filings, business permits, and inspection approvals. Meticulously organized, verified. The official scanned the pages, irritation flickering behind controlled eyes. She is compliant, Bumpy said quietly. Fully. The crowd leaned in without stepping forward. You cannot charge a woman with association, Bumpy continued. That is not a crime, that is community. The suited official's jaw tightened. You think you can lecture? U.S.? Bumpy met his gaze steadily. No, he replied. I think I can remind you. The uniformed man handed the documents back, face stiff. He knew what Bumpy was doing. In daylight, in front of witnesses with paperwork in hand, Bumpy had removed their leverage. If they forced the issue now, it would look personal, not procedural. Mrs. Carter stood straighter. The principal, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. If there is no formal charge, he said carefully, perhaps this can be handled privately. The official weighed his options. Pride versus optics. Bumpy offered him a final door. If you leave now, he said quietly, you preserve your authority. If you press without cause, you create something you won't control. The statement was not a threat. It was analysis. The uniformed man exhaled slowly. We will review further, he said stiffly. For now, Mrs. Carter is free to go. A ripple of relief spread across the gathered parents. Not applause, not cheers, but something stronger. Collective steadiness. The officials returned to their cars. Without further spectacle. Mrs. Carter's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her coat. She looked at Bumpy, emotion threatening to spill over. They wanted to make me afraid, she whispered. They wanted everyone afraid. Bumpy corrected gently. A small boy stepped forward from the crowd, the same boy from the night of the scream. He stood a little taller now. They can't scare everybody, he said quietly. Bumpy looked at him, a faint smile touching his expression. No, he said, not if everybody stands. As the school bell rang, children poured out, unaware of how close the day had come to redefining their neighborhood. Parents dispersed slowly, heads higher than when they arrived. Elijah approached Bumpy once the street cleared. That was close, he murmured. Bumpy nodded. It will get closer. Why don't they stop? Elijah asked. Bumpy looked down the street where the cars had vanished. Because power unused feels wasted, he said quietly. And they believe Harlem belongs to their silence. He adjusted his gloves thoughtfully. But silence, he added, belongs to no one. As he walked away from the school, sunlight catching the edge of his coat, Harlem felt different again. Not safe, not yet, but awakened. 2 public traps had failed. Not through violence. Not through chaos. but through composure sharpened into precision. Somewhere downtown, men would be recalculating. Because the most frustrating opponent is not the loudest. It is the one who remains calm in daylight. And now they understood something dangerous. Bumpy Johnson was not defending territory. He was defending dignity, and dignity, once defended successfully, becomes contagious. Harlem did not erupt after the school confrontation. It did something far more dangerous. It steadied. In the days that followed, shopkeepers opened their doors on time. Mothers walked children to school with their shoulders squared. Men who once avoided eye contact with patrol cars now met them calmly, without challenge, without submission. No banners were raised, no speeches were made. But something invisible had shifted beneath the pavement. Harlem had tasted what it felt like to witness injustice stopped without violence, and that taste lingered. Downtown, however, patience was thinning. The failure at the school had not gone unnoticed in certain offices where polished desks reflected polished egos. A small circle of influential men, business interests, municipal authorities, and those who benefited from Harlem's instability met behind closed doors to discuss a problem they hadn't anticipated. Bumpy Johnson was not behaving the way a man in his position was expected to behave. He wasn't escalating. He wasn't retaliating. He wasn't giving them a spectacle they could condemn. Instead, he was choosing composure, and that composure was dismantling their strategy piece by piece. A calm adversary is the most difficult to defeat. So they designed something different. Not a confrontation, not a public accusation. Something subtler. Something that would not involve police batons or school steps. They decided to starve Harlem within a week. Supply shipments to several local businesses were delayed. Credit lines were reassessed. A warehouse that serviced multiple neighborhood grocers suddenly closed for inspection. Deliveries of flour, canned goods, medicine items that rarely made headlines but sustained daily life began. Arriving late or not at all. No official announcement was made. No single act was dramatic. But collectively, it created pressure. The design was simple. Make the neighborhood uncomfortable enough that unity became inconvenient. Bumpy saw it almost immediately. He didn't need a memo to understand patterns. He walked the streets, listening. Mrs. Carter mentioned a pharmaceutical distributor refusing to extend her usual grace period. A baker spoke quietly about shipments halved without explanation. Even the jazz club owner noted that certain permits were taking longer to renew. This was not chaos. This was strategy. One evening, Bumpy gathered a small group of trusted figures, not men with reputations for force, but men known for fairness. Clergy, shopkeepers, teachers, a retired postal supervisor who had earned respect through decades of consistency. They met in the back of this same modest restaurant where part one had begun. The air smelled of stew and quiet determination. They want frustration, Elijah said. They want someone to snap. Bumpy nodded slightly. And if someone snaps, he said, they get what they've been waiting for. Then what do we do? Asked the baker, hands dusted with flour even at night. Bumpy folded his hands on the table. We do not snap, he said calmly. We organize. The word landed differently than any command could have. He continued, voice steady and deliberate. If one grocer runs low, another shares. If medicine is delayed, we coordinate bulk orders directly. If a supplier closes a door, we find another, not through anger, but through planning. The retired postal supervisor leaned forward. You're talking about a cooperative. I'm talking about independence, Bumpy replied softly. Over. The next days, Harlem moved not in panic, but in coordination. Information was shared, supplies were pooled. New distributors were contacted quietly through legitimate channels outside the city's usual gatekeepers. It was not glamorous work. It required patience, bookkeeping, phone calls that stretched late into the evening. But it was effective, and it infuriated the men who had engineered the Shortages. Because pressure without panic loses power. Downtown, impatience curdled into something more reckless. If economic strain would not fracture Harlem, perhaps public disgrace would. They needed a spectacle grand enough to restore fear. The opportunity arrived in the form of a citywide civic gala, a formal event meant to celebrate community partnerships. Business leaders, political figures, and select neighborhood representatives were invited. It was theater disguised as unity. Bumpy received an invitation. It was unexpected, but not surprising. If they could not isolate him, perhaps they could humiliate him in a room designed to remind him of where official power truly sat. Elijah studied the invitation carefully. "It's a trap," he said plainly. Bumpy considered the embossed lettering, the polite phrasing. "Of course it is," he replied. "Then why go?" Elijah asked. Bumpy looked up slowly. "Because declining would make them comfortable." The gala took place in a grand Manhattan ballroom, far removed from Harlem's brownstones and jazz halls. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished marble floors. Men in tailored suits moved with rehearsed confidence. Women elegant. Gowns exchanged smiles that rarely reached their eyes. When Bumpy entered, conversations dipped briefly, not dramatically, but noticeably. He wore a simple black tuxedo, impeccably fitted but unflashy. His posture was straight, his expression composed. He did not look like an outsider seeking approval. He looked like a man fully aware of who he was. Dutch Schultz's era had taught many in that room to view Harlem as territory, not community. Though Schultz himself was no longer orchestrating events, his legacy of manipulation lingered in attitudes and alliances. Some of the businessmen present had once benefited from his methods. They remembered Harlem as a place to extract from, not invest in. The evening proceeded with speeches praising cooperation and prosperity. Words like integration, opportunity, and partnership floated above tables laden with silverware and fine wine. Bumpy listened without expression. Then, midway through the program, one of the city officials took the stage again. "We'd like to acknowledge representatives from neighborhoods that have shown unique approaches to self-management," he said, a faint edge beneath the polished tone. "Mr. Ellsworth Johnson, perhaps you'd care to share how Harlem maintains such autonomy." A spotlight shifted toward Bumpy's table. It was the kind of moment designed for misstep. Say too little and appear intimidated. Say too much and confirm their caricature of aggression. Bumpy rose slowly. The ballroom quieted. He walked to the podium without haste, hands relaxed at his sides. When he reached the microphone, he did not immediately speak. He allowed the silence to settle, not as tension, but as space. Then he began. "Autonomy," he repeated softly. "That's an interesting word." A few faint chuckles from corners of the room. "In Harlem," he continued calmly, "we call it responsibility." His voice was not loud, but it carried effortlessly. "We've learned that waiting for rescue rarely works. So we learn to cooperate with each other. We share resources. We support small businesses. We encourage our children to stand tall. And when mistakes happen, we correct them without destroying each other." Several heads shifted uncomfortably. Bumpy's eyes scanned the room evenly. "We do not seek isolation," he said. "We seek fairness." The official who had invited him smiled tightly. "And what does fairness look like, Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy paused just long enough for the question to feel deliberate. "Fairness," he said quietly, "looks like not staging accusations in daylight. It looks like not threatening widows with paperwork. It looks like allowing communities to breathe without tightening the air." The room stilled. He had not raised his voice. He had not named names. But every person present understood the reference. "You invited me here tonight," Bumpy continued. "So I assume you value dialogue. Dialogue requires honesty. If this city wants partnership with Harlem, then partnership must replace pressure." A silence thicker than applause followed. He stepped back from the microphone, not waiting for reaction. For a long moment, no one moved. Then unexpectedly, a soft clap began from the far side of the room. It was not one of Harlem's representatives. It was a mid-level banker whose own daughter attended college with a scholarship funded by neighborhood cooperatives. His applause was hesitant, but it spread one table at a time, not thunderous, not unanimous, but undeniable. The official at the podium forced a polite smile, nodding as if this had been the plan all along. Bumpy returned to his seat. Elijah leaned in slightly. "You just told them no," he murmured. Bumpy's expression remained neutral. "I told them yes," he corrected. "To fairness." The following weeks unfolded differently. Supply lines quietly resumed normal pace. Inspections concluded without incident. The overt pressure dissipated, not out of generosity, but calculation. Public humiliation had failed. Economic strain had failed. The gala had exposed that Harlem's composure could not be easily caricatured. Back on Lenox Avenue, life continued. The boy from the street corner began volunteering at Mrs. Carter's pharmacy after school. The cooperative strengthened. Teachers at Public School 89 introduced new civic clubs encouraging students to understand rights and responsibilities. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but confidently. One evening, as Bumpy walked past the same street lamp where the mother had once screamed, he paused briefly. The winter air felt lighter now. Not safe but steadier. Elijah joined him. "Do you think they're done?" he asked. Bumpy looked down the block, where children played despite the cold, their laughter echoing against brick. "No," he said quietly. "Power never stops testing." He adjusted his gloves thoughtfully. "But neither does dignity." The true victory had not been in defeating an opponent. It had been in refusing to become one. Harlem had not erupted. It had organized. It had not begged. It had spoken. And in the end, the storm that had threatened to break over the neighborhood did something unexpected. It quieted. Not because injustice disappeared, but because it had encountered something stronger than force. A man who understood that the most powerful weapon in a divided city is not violence. It is composure, and the silence that follows it.